Let's see. Am I on?
Yes.
Okay. You will not get the final installment of Stefania's talk from me. I don't know anything about this problem. So anyway, I wanted to, I feel that I'm not a real expert in social reproduction. And I will tell you that some people I know well, writing on South Africa, recently said that I was the only person who wrote about social reproduction that they knew without ever using the term. And there was something to that. So I'm going to use this time to tell you why I've had a long-term, very long-term ambivalence about how to use the term. Yeah, and this whole day has not led me to resolve my confusion. I've learned how powerful and useful the term can be with people doing new research and new thinking, and that's been great. But I remain with some reservations about what we're getting at. So I think it's worth airing those because this is, after all, a workshop, so it's useful. I think that most people here are working within a Marxist-feminist tradition. It's not that the term social reproduction is not used by other people, but I think mainly it is one of our contributions. And I think that that contribution emerges from a fundamental point made by Marx, but which wasn't really developed, which is the distinction between labor power and living labor. And the idea that in capitalism, unlike other modes of production that reproduced the cycle of production, when you do the cycle of production for capitalism, you see capitalism arriving at the phase where it is purchasing a commodity that it does not itself make, labor power. So the distinction was that unlike slavery, where in fact slaves were bought and sold, owned, that what capital buys is a commodity, labor power, and then must take the living labor from that commodity in the process of production, an act which is contested. So the question arises, obviously in Marx really, as well, is, well, where is labor power made then? And in his work, it's hard to find something more specific than the stuff about the historical creation of the wage, that it's the product of histories, existing social relations. In other words, there's not a general theory of the production of the commodity labor power. And that was always both a puzzle and a point of interest for us, a possible point of entry for us, I think. And so the original idea was trying to understand the social conditions under which people came to offer their commodity labor power. And that tied it to concepts of primitive accumulation when you tried to think about it historically. But it also tied you to thinking about, well, what does life mean? These questions about a living wage. What's the relationship between what the capitalist pays and the actual living wage? I mean, what does that mean? Is that inherent in capitalism? And these were puzzles for us. And I think that they're important puzzles to understand. And I don't think that people including now, give exactly the same answers. I think there's some ambiguities that I want to talk about, and some advantages and disadvantages, because I want to emphasize that social reproduction is like other Marxist concepts, something that should refer to reality. It should be historically appropriate, but it's a concept. It's a way of thinking about something. It's an analytical concept. And analytical concepts are not reality. They're a picture of reality, but they should describe, they should be appropriate, historically speaking. So, although I think there are these differences, I wrote down on these slides. Oh, where's the slide clicker? Is that this thing? Oh, the keyboard. Where's the key? Oh, the keyboard's over here. Sorry about this. I'm low tech. Not really. I'm just slow tech. Anyway, so it's the return button, right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so I think that we, in thinking about this, we have some common premises that we share. I'm not actually even sure I got my premises written down properly, but these common premises are about historical materialism. They're about the role of history in our material lives. And the first one is one that comes from feminist theory and was hard won, very hard won, I think. That the gender division of labor, and I called them here patriarchal social relations, so you can bracket what you want to say. I myself don't know exactly. Feminist, I mean, there are many things one can say, are contextually variable in space and time. Thus, they are not biologically determined, they're not natural, they're not universal, and they're not fixed. And this was, I began as an anthropologist, so this was quite important to work out for us, because there were many people, well, to this day, looking at primate studies to see what the base of this is, yeah? I don't think there is such a base, and I'm not waiting to find it. Yeah. And what's the proof of that? The proof of that for me was also anthropological, which is the wide variety of differences in how gender was organized, which we didn't call gender at that point. I will also be honest about that. Anyway, and that difference, understanding those differences, is also the basis for understanding that they can change. And that was important. The second premise is one that as I said, I don't think I wrote this all that well, which is that capitalism is also a historically specific system. It is not forever. It is not the expression of universals in human nature, like the maximizing individual or the war of all against all, or whichever one you might take. It is a historical system. And that means that it can end. And that's, like the case of gender, quite important, because it means that politically you're not living in something which is universally in front of you, yeah? Which you might make it better, you might make it worse. No, the premise with which we started was we can get rid of it. And that was extremely important to us at the time. It's still important to me now. So it's specific, and it has contradictory relations of production that compel it towards reproduction on an expanded scale, and that it creates forms of work and everyday life that are based not in private ownership of the means of production and exploitation of wage labor. It creates plenty of those as well, but it also creates and maintains and lives with alternative forms of work. So that is also, I think, important because it means that we recognize that we're not just looking at a world of wage labor, but we're not just waiting for it inevitably to appear. That's not our sole focus of political action and change. We want to look at where wage labor fits in relation to other forms of work. And this means that the question of gender and the gendered nature of work opens itself up in a quite broader scale. Yeah, there are many things that you can look at. But how you look at them conceptually has varied over time. Now, it must be said that from a feminist point of view, there's an interesting point here, which is that, yes, in the capitalist world, there are new forms of labor being created. Sometimes it's even petty capitalism developing out of crisis. You know, there's lots of stuff. But why is it then that in these new forms we see that gender hierarchies seem to reproduce themselves quite firmly as well? How does that happen? You know, to give you I mean, this is an exaggerated example, but before there were ARVs in Southern Africa being distributed widely, there was a lot of death and suffering from HIV, from AIDS. And in the course of that, new jobs in this period of creation of new kinds of casual, low-paid, you might call, labor, the volunteer system was used extensively in South Africa, not corresponding to any minimum wage or anything. You know, recruiting volunteers to be care workers for families that did not have the possibility of dealing with people dying of AIDS, many of whom returned home to their rural areas, you know, where they were born. And these volunteers were hired with a very low payment. But somebody did good ethnography on this subject and found that in general there was a sexual division of labor. The men were counselors. They went to talk about the meaning of life and death and, you know, that sort of thing. And the women did all of the cleanup. And with people dying of AIDS, that is a lot. The disposal of all your illness waste, just the normal hygiene of everyday life is really, really messy and difficult. And the women did all that work. So there's something about, in this current phase, the reproduction of new forms of casual work, new forms of, these aren't new in places like Southern Africa, but their gendered nature is very, very strong. Now, when I say that we wanted to look at them historically then, we wanted to understand the contradictions. We wanted to look at the root of conflicts. We did not want to just show that situations like the men being the counselors and women doing the shit work, literally, were, you know, that just to say that's the way it is isn't enough. How does it change? It's the points of entry. And that's what Marxism's focus on historical contradiction should give us. Points of entry. The system is not infallible. Capitalism reproduces itself in crisis all the time. When is it that those moments of crisis are something that you can actually use? How do you intervene? And how do you guarantee, as a feminist, that the outcomes are not, we can't guarantee it, but how do you work to make sure that what happens is not a repetition of the old sexual division of labor and the relations of sexual authority? Okay, so it seemed to me that it's in that context that thinking about how those propositions are interrelated is a core Marxist task. And certainly social reproduction theory has provided one of the ways of thinking about the relationship between these two concepts. Yeah. But I do have these problems. So I thought I'd talk about my problems, which are more about the things that can go wrong than that they may necessarily go wrong. And they clearly have gone right for lots of you. You've found and named and thought about important things. But I still want to raise these issues, some of which relate to problems from my early first, career. Because I should say that I've worked with this concept of social reproduction my whole life, in my whole academic life. Though I never now use the word, and that's true, yeah. Okay, so the first problem I have is ambiguity in what it actually means. And, maybe all of you can tell me, but I think that some of what was written by Ed Holm and Olivia Harris, and I think it was Kate at the beginning, I don't know what year, 1979 or 78 or something, is still somewhat true. They distinguished 3 different ways in which the term was used in discussions of social reproduction. The overall reproduction of the social formation. Yeah. So this was within the Marxist literature, using the term social formation. So that it was that you were reproducing the social relations of capitalist society as a whole. And that is still used by many people. And there are reasons for using it. It's recognition that a person is a bearer, an embodied person is also a bearer of social relations. So it makes sense that social reproduction can mean reproducing those relations. That's a very broad mandate, huh? If you think about it. And it's a lot to hold on to one particular area of life, or you say it's all of life. But reproduction of capitalist society as a whole would be, clearly not accomplished by just one moment within it. But you can still see that there are arguments for the term. The second thing they said is that it's used as reproduction of labor. And actually, I think they really probably meant labor power, if I think about it. But what they wrote was reproduction of labor, reproduction of adequate bearers of specific social relationships. Now, that makes sense, but it's very functionalist. Adequate for whom and for what? That is, in this, both in the first and second formulation, it can sound fairly functionalist, that there is some guarantee that the capitalist social formation be reproduced, and things exist so that the overall social formation can be reproduced. That's a little dangerous from the point of view of looking at points of entry, because we're not interested in how it's reproduced, except to the extent that we're identifying its moments of weakness where we can make a difference. And finally, that it's used for specific forms of biological reproduction of human beings. Now, I think maybe that's rarely done now, but sometimes it's not so clear either. And the ambiguities question in the Titi Barsharia collection, I found a lot of ambiguity. so I didn't straighten it out for myself in reading it. And of course, you could answer, that's not the point. Are these debates productive? Are they leading to interesting work? Well, probably have to say yes, but, it's a problem. Obviously, I'm taking longer than I thought. Well, anyway, so I guess everybody has, though, haven't you? But I will stop. Anyway, so the thing is, and this is where I have to go to slide 2, I thought, what if we go back to Marx's distinction and think about it in a different way? That what's different about capitalism for Marx, and this is more discussed in Theory of Surplus Value, Volume 1, which was supposed to be Volume 4 of Capital, which was never really finished. And the point about, and I think it's correct, is that capital is basically a study of capitalism from the point of view of the logic of capital, but that he releases the assumption in theories of surplus value of that existing on its own, and says that the distinction between labor power and living labor is a fetishized concept, because the commodity labor power never exists apart from living labor. It is only embodied in living labor. So that I don't actually really see the need to have, to invoke the society as a whole. I think, though, that what we need to think about is the reproduction of living labor. And maybe social production is the best way to say that. But certainly the reproduction of living labor is not a very good thing to write down. But I think that the questions of analytical content are nonetheless interesting. So I wanted to say, look, I think that this can be, the production, social reproduction thing, which separates them as two moments, can be analytically dualist. We're interested, I think, more often in concepts, can I get away from, oh no, how far? Maybe not, no. In concepts that cross-cut the world of living, oh yeah, clever, of living labor, so that class cross-cuts, gender cross-cuts, where race is an issue of social hierarchy, which it is in many cases, then it cross-cuts. Yeah? So I think we can begin with a single field and ask the questions that we want to ask without assuming that there's a functional relationship between production and social reproduction. Costs and benefits. Now, what I can say is that, you may look at this thing, because here when I'm looking at living labor and wage labor, which is basically wage labor in value-producing work or whatever, that category is for Marx always living labor. So there's not a boundary there. I've drawn it, but I tried to make it, broken to show that it's not a real boundary. I know, 2 minutes. We're skipping my very last section, so everything will be okay. So that part is what you get. It's quite simple. But on the other hand, I think it allows you to link to other important concepts in Marx, which tell us a lot about the relationship between different kinds of work. One is the distinction between the intensification of the labor day and the extension of the labor day, where what you have with this is the recognition that getting living labor to produce value is difficult within capitalism, and that there's a constant class struggle within the process of production itself, not just at the moment when wages are paid. And in my work on health and on these big capitalist and these enterprises. The extension of the working day is not just at the point of production, not just within an enterprise. Women's extension of the labor day, because of the organization of that work, is extremely long. And I think that's important, and I think we can handle it within this, and it's important to look at. Similarly, the intensification of the labor day is very important. And just to, I won't fit within my 2 minutes, but to give you some examples, they've eliminated on these sugar plantations in Mozambique, not all of them, but they have instituted what they call clean wages, so that the old system used to be to give workers something to eat during the day, particularly, it's agricultural work, and also to provide water. Now they give you a water bottle, a plastic water bottle, that you are to fill, and you're supposed to bring your own water, and you're supposed to bring your own food from home. That is both male and female workers, yeah? This is an extension of the labor day of the working woman at home, and sometimes that is the worker there. So it tells you quite a lot about how this system is working, what the wage does and does not do. So I think it's a possibility to have a bit more space. I also think that you can introduce here the idea of classes of labor more easily, yeah, because it's a cross-cutting category. And therefore that you can think about what basis of different bases of an alliance are. So, it does that well. Or it provides some indicators. And it also does allow, I think, slightly more easily the possibility of thinking about the household as a constellation, a shifting constellation of different processes rather than a fixed space. Yeah. Because the variety of forms of organization of households is so great. And it's important, I think, in organizing politically to take advantage of recognizing those changes. So I am now going to end without doing what I said I'd do, which was to show how this was all related to political analysis by returning to Meillassoux' old concept of the domestic mode of production, its use in South Africa by Wolpe, and the resultant analytical dualism, which I think has hampered at least the Marxist critique of current development policy in South Africa. It's not to say that that's the only cause, but the critique thus far is weak. And I think that relates to not dealing with the gendered and racial basis of production of living labor in South Africa. But I'm not showing that. Sorry. That's it. And I didn't do anything either on ecology, though to some extent there's an entry with the idea that in the circuit of reproduction, there's no guarantee whatsoever by capital that it reproduces a necessary part of the environmental resources that go into the process of production. That boundary is completely unclear. Yeah? It's only political force which gets them to change the boundary in some way. But that's, from my point of view, I don't think you can fit gender and nature together on that basis, on the basis of exclusion. There are other categories may help you, but not that one. Sorry.